We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let everyone come into the Zoom room. I can see that we're already up to 66 participants, but I know more RSVP'd, and we'll just let people filter in for just a minute. Well, thank you all so much for being here for this fantastic event on extremism, anti-democratic violence, and the second impeachment trial, a conversation with Senator Jeff Flake. I'm Magda Hinojosa. I'm the interim director of the School of Politics and Global Studies. I'm so very pleased that we are able to host this important and I would say very essential conversation regarding the events of January 6th, the lead up to this very historic day and its aftermath. Please know that we are hoping for some questions from the audience. So please go ahead and type your questions in as we go along. To get us started, I am thrilled to introduce former US Senator Jeff Flake, who is now serving as Distinguished Dean's Fellow with the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. From 2013 to 2019, Senator Flake served as one of Arizona's 2 senators in the US Senate. And while in the Senate, he chaired the Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law, as well as the Africa Subcommittee of the Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to that, he served 6 terms in the US House of Representatives and served as Executive Director of the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. Senator Flake is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Conscience of a Conservative, a rejection of destructive politics and a return to principle. I would also like to introduce Professor Gina Woodall. She is senior lecturer in the School of Politics and Global Studies and has been a lecturer in the school since July 2007. She received all 3 of her degrees, her bachelor's, master's, and doctorate from Arizona State University. Professor Woodall teaches research methods, American government statistics, and women in politics, as well as her very popular course on fake news. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Professor Woodall now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you so much for being here, taking the time. We really appreciate it. We had a lot of questions. There's a lot going on right now in the news, and we wanted to focus, though, on extremism, anti-democratic violence, and then, of course, former President Trump's second impeachment trial, which was historic. So I kind of want to get into it, but again, I wanted to welcome you here. And again, thank you for everybody that is on the Zoom. It includes our students, it includes alum, it includes friends of the school, and then community members that wanted to Zoom in with you today. So thank you so much. The first question, and I think this was asked by a student, but I generally ask it too because I teach, many of our students are budding politicians. But what inspired you to go into politics, Senator? And the follow-up question is a little bit more difficult. How would you compare the GOP to when you got into politics to the GOP today?
Well, great question. I came of political age, I guess, in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan as president. When I was in high school, he was the president, and he was inspiring. I mean, he was, it was always morning in America. That was attractive to me. Plus, I was raised on a farm in a small rural community, and I wanted to quit milking cows every morning. So politics or anything to get me off the farm was a good bet. So I was inspired by a lot of the politicians at that time. Obviously, Barry Goldwater from Arizona, that rugged individualism appealed to me. But that was back when the party really trafficked in ideas. During the 1990s, when I was running the Goldwater Institute, the party under Newt Gingrich mostly, staged a coup, if you will, because Democrats had controlled the House of Representatives for more than 40 years. And Republicans had what was called the contract with America. It was really ideas-based. And that appealed to me, particularly running a think tank. So that was really what prompted my getting involved in politics. I didn't think I'd run for elected office anytime soon. But during the 1990s, as I mentioned, the Republicans were interested in ideas. I think that waned a bit once Republicans took control of the House. Newt Gingrich found governing a little more difficult than campaigning, I believe. And by the time I got to Congress in 2001, the party was, the interest in ideas, I guess, was waning a bit, but it was still very much there. I would argue that today, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, it's changed very much. It's more, wanting to own the libs or talk about culture wars. And just one thing that struck me today when I was hearing on the news what Republicans are talking about, what they're when they go on, particularly on Fox News, this culture stuff reminded me of about 2005, when Republicans in the House of Representatives had kind of given up on ideas, given up on limited government. We had expanded government quite a bit. We were earmarking and spending money in ways, not just levels, but in ways that were offensive. And so the party turned at that time to kind of the culture wars, trying to get a flag burning amendment through. There was a woman by the name of Terry Schiavo who had had a tragic case where she had lost all function, and Republicans were trying to intervene federally against the wishes of her family to keep her alive. And it was all, away from traditional limited government, economic freedom, free trade, strong American leadership, those kind of ideas that had animated the party. And I thought there were a lot of parallels in 2005 to the party today, and which ought to be ominous for Republicans, because we went on to lose the House of Representatives in 2006. And so I think there are a lot of concerns out there. But yeah, that's really what motivated me is the ideas and trying to actually move some of these ideas through a legislative body.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer. All throughout your book, and I have to say, and the senator didn't tell me to do this, but this is his book. It's Conscience of a Conservative, after former Senator Goldwater, who you evoke a lot in this book. But this is a short read. It's not very long, which I think will be helpful to a lot of students. But in this book, I read it again. It was published in 2017. And you really do, keep coming back to traditional conservatism and exactly what you said: economic freedom, limited government, kind of statesmanship, little regulation, and going back to small L liberal democracy. I mean, I think the argument can be made that right now we are in an illiberal democracy, and some scholars and others that study democracy have made that case, I think, quite compelling. And so, given where the party is right now, and given that many members of the Republican Party kind of are going to be staying the course, it seems like, in this post-Trump era that we're in, some members of the Republican Party are doubling down on that, elected officials, of course, and then also rank and file. So how do you convince Republicans and maybe some independents to go back that traditional conservatism is the best way, right? It's the right way. It's the best way to go forward if you are a Republican.
That's a great question, Gina. And I think a lot of us are trying to figure out how we do appeal. If you look at politics today, Joe Biden, came in. He was elected as really his record has been more of a moderate throughout his 36 years in the Senate and 8 years as VP. But you could argue in the last, since the president was elected, it's taken a decidedly progressive turn with a lot of the executive orders that have gone forward, as well as this COVID package, this relief package, which is a very, very progressive bill. So I would think that in a lot of states, just continuing to be a Trump Republican, in contrast with what the Democrats are doing, which is, like I said, a decidedly progressive or left turn, that may be enough. And I think Republicans may win back a few seats in many states. The problem is for Republicans is politically. I would argue there are other problems as well, but politically, in states like Arizona or Colorado or Nevada, and states that we want to win races, Senate races, Pennsylvania, it's not going to be enough just to kind of hew the Trump line. In fact, that has led to 2 Democratic senators representing the state of Arizona, even though Republicans still have a pretty sizable voter registration advantage. So I think it may, unfortunately, for Republicans, take a few cycles of election losses. Nothing focuses the mind like a big election loss, and that should, it should have happened a little more since Donald Trump was elected 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago. Republicans lost the House of Representatives in 2018. We lost the Senate in 2020. We lost the White House in 2020. And in 2018, I believe we lost more than 400 legislative seats nationwide. And there were a few pickups back in 2020, but nothing compared to what we had. And so I believe that this should have led to more introspection than it has. But depending on what Democrats do, if they continue to push more progressive causes, like I said, a lot of the Republican Party around the country will say, hey, we're just fine. We can pick up seats just writing this out, just owning the libs, just pointing out how liberal the country is going. And unfortunately, that may be enough in many states. It just won't be in enough states to win statewide elections and national elections.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. There was and just kind of sticking to the theme of the Republican Party, there was a New York Times article on Friday. I don't know if you saw, it was Maggie Haberman, and she reported on a survey that was conducted by it was a pollster. They looked at about 1,200 Republicans. So an N of about 1,200, it's a pretty decent size poll. And the pollster ended up identifying five tribes within the Republican Party. So they were trying to see kind of where the Republican Party is going. They identified Trump boosters, 28% were Trump boosters. Those were people that approve of his policies, but really want someone else to lead the party. They identified diehard Trumpers, so about 27%. These are Republicans that do not hold kind of the QAnon beliefs, but do support the president. Post-Trump GOP, this was about 20%. These are people that said they like him, they respect former President Trump, they think somebody else should take the party moving forward. About 15% were never Trumpers. And then about 10% were called InfoWars GOP, so kind of the QAnon conspiracy folks. And so given these different, strains of the Republican Party, and then all of this group together, about 57% they would support Trump again moving forward in 2024 or down the line. But that's down from about 80 to 85% that said they approved of his job performance when he was in office. So this is pretty split. This is pretty people that are seeing, kind of different pathways for the Republican Party. What are your thoughts on that? On kind of, people that like him, but they want the GOP to pick somebody else versus the never Trumpers versus, just the different strains in the Republican Party.
Right. Well, I did see that piece. It's sobering, to say the least, if you're a Republican who believes that Republicans need to win elections. Now, the president went to CPAC a few weeks ago, and there was a straw poll there, as there always is. Given what the figures you just read, I found it interesting what the outcome of that poll was, and it was just 50-some% wanted to see him reelected. And if you're trying to find a more Trumpy group around the country, I don't think you could find a more Trumpy group than among CPAC followers. And if you can only get 50-some% saying run again, then you shouldn't run again. And I maintain the president has no intention of running again. He certainly wants to keep that floated out because he's more relevant the longer that is out. And he likely could now and would win a Republican primary. But he knows well, I believe, and most Republicans know that he wouldn't win the general. He lost the last one by 7 million votes, by 72 electoral votes. There's no indication that it should be any different this next time. And plus, that was before January 6th, which turned another group of people against the president. So I do think that there's not a sizable number that really want the president to run again. He will not run again, but there still is the problem of the president maintaining big influence in the party and endorsing candidates that will win the primary, but then go on and lose a general election. And so that presents a big problem for the party. But as far as his own polls, I mean, we used to conduct these kind of polls. John McCain used to joke that our popularity sometimes is down to paid staff and blood relatives. and I would think that if you go to CPAC and can't get a better result than 50-some% wanting you to run again, that's kind of a paid staff and blood relatives kind of poll you're taking. But it does present big problems for the party because I think to the extent that they say they want the president's policies. Now, there are some policies of the president that anyone would consider conservative, lower taxes, less regulation, particularly those economic policies that, and some of the more populist policies I'm not too fond of, the protectionist policies are popular, and that will be a bigger part of the party, will kind of retreat from being the free trade party. I recognize that. I'm not happy about it, but I recognize that. But there are also elements of the Trump policy, if you will, that should have no place in the party. A Muslim ban, or this toying with white supremacists and not condemning them, and simply, or the giving in and trafficking in conspiracy theories. That will get you some diehard followers, but it runs a lot more people off and away from the party, particularly millennials and suburbanites, particularly suburban women. They just decided that they want no part of that. And it's difficult to win national elections and some statewide elections if you're basically writing off that group.
So true. That's very true. You need some suburban women to win the vote. You had mentioned the insurrection on January 6th, and I want to just talk. We had some questions about that. One question said or asked, why was little attention given to other attacks on federal buildings and on our national mall that began in May of 2020? And a follow-up to that is, did you ever think you would see something like that in your lifetime, what we witnessed at the Capitol on January 6th?
Well, second question first. No, I never thought I would see anything like that. I was at the Capitol for some really strange events that I never thought I'd see, awful events, 9/11. That was my first year in Congress. I never thought we'd see anything like that. But in any scenario I would try to create, I would never think that Americans would attack the Capitol as they did and try to overturn a legitimate election, really at the encouragement of the president who had lost the election. So no, that was just beyond anything that I saw. Yeah, I think in terms of what happened in the summer, there were some very progressive politicians who tried to excuse a lot of the property damage and the riots that were going on against federal buildings or private businesses. I wouldn't put Joe Biden in that camp, and I think that's part of the reason that he won the presidency, is he didn't condone that. But yeah, I think we ought to pay attention to any destruction of federal property, and perhaps there should have been more attention paid to it. But it wasn't as if it was escaping, press scrutiny. It had some.
Yeah. And following up on that, again, focusing on anti-democratic violence and the rise of anti-democratic violence in the United States. How do you think this affects our relations with other countries, in particular with Mexico? And then kind of piggybacking on that question, what about the implications for immigration reform? Again, you were a part of the Gang of Eight, and you worked pretty hard to try to reform and immigration, and now kind of given everything that we've lived through, right, the past year, where do you kind of see immigration reform on the totem pole, particularly in the Senate?
Well, on that first question, what is the riots and January 6th, how does that affect our ability to deal with other countries? It obviously makes it more difficult. I'll just give one anecdote. I've spent time in my life in Zimbabwe. They had a long dictator, 37 years, Robert Mugabe. I actually wrote my master's thesis on his hold on power back in the 80s. And then in 2018, actually met with him for a very memorable, terrible 4-hour meeting. But he was removed from the scene, and their new leader, Mnangagwa, has been under sanctions by the United States for continuing some of the policies of Mugabe. Mnangagwa, after January 6th, sent out a tweet saying, we here in Zimbabwe are being sanctioned by the United States for anti-democratic behavior. What do you have to say for yourselves now? That was paraphrasing what he said. And he wasn't the only one. There were dictators and tyrants around the world celebrating and making it more difficult for us to have the moral authority we need to encourage countries to move toward freedom. So in terms of the next question on immigration, it's going to be a tough road ahead, I think, for immigration reform. During my 18 years in Congress, I tried for the entire 18 years to get comprehensive reform. And there were a couple of elements of immigration reform that would have been a lot easier to move on their own. For example, dealing with the Dreamers, the now called the DACA population. That's something that there was enough of a consensus, a bipartisan consensus, that we could have removed that section, of comprehensive reform and passed it on its own. Another element was, high-skilled visas. Pretty much bipartisan recognition that we benefit by allowing people to come in and create jobs in Silicon Valley and whatnot. But now, today, in this environment, it would be difficult to move any of those pieces on their own because there's been a real retreat, particularly on the Republican side, from comprehensive reform. And it makes it even more difficult when you have real pressure at the border, which we are seeing again. And regardless of what the Biden administration is saying, this is a crisis. when we have a number of beds and spaces filled with unaccompanied minors or others, we've got a problem. And it's going to make dealing with the broader issue even more difficult. I don't see the package that has been introduced really moving anywhere. There's just not enough impetus on the Republican side, and frankly, probably not among Democrats either. Now, if the Supreme Court were to come back and rule that DACA was unconstitutional, and these individuals who were protected by it would be, have those protections removed, then you might be able to get the Congress to move ahead and grant permanent relief somehow. But as long as the court is allowing that to happen, there's just not enough motivation, frankly, in the House or in the Senate to do that. So I would hope, I'm all in favor of comprehensive reform that includes a path to citizenship, and includes robust temporary or guest worker plans in the future. We're going to need them, and we desperately need to fix our enforcement system here, whether it's through some of the programs that we already have or new ones. And then we obviously still need to fortify the border. I would think more on the technology side and our ports of entry, and not just thinking we can do it with some kind of wall. But there's a lot that needs to be done, and I unfortunately don't see a lot of impetus to do that right now.
Thank you. We were talking about immigration, so kind of going back to bipartisanship. This question was asked, and I think it's a really important one. We're not seeing it, definitely not seeing it in the Senate or the House, for that matter. And I know that you were very much against and led the charge against earmarks. I think for noble reasons, for sure. But I think that the argument, and it has been made, and you mentioned this in your book, that perhaps if we allowed earmarks again, kind of reintroduce them, perhaps that would kind of force Republicans and Democrats to work together. If there were certain rules, and if there were kind of regulations and rules with earmarks. What do you think about that? Do you think that kind of allowing earmarks kind of back in might be able to force Republicans and Democrats to work together? Because right now, as you know, it's just not happening, right? And we've lost that bipartisanship. So what do you think about that?
Well, I'm not a fan of bringing earmarks back. Earmarks, let me just give a little history here. Earmarks have been around, and that's basically one member of Congress being able to lay claim on a very small part of the federal budget for a bridge at home or something for the home folks. That's been around as long as the Republic has, but it was really on the margins. The powerful chairman, a majority leader, or others would have control of a few of these projects. In the 1980s, it started to expand, and Ronald Reagan vetoed the highway bill, saying that he hadn't seen this much pork since he gave away ribbons at the county fair. And that was vetoing a transportation bill that had 130 earmarks, I believe, in it. In 2005, the transportation bill had more than 2,000 earmarks in it. So the Congress, mostly under Republicans in the 90s, really expanded earmarks, where every member felt it was kind of their entitlement to have a certain number of projects. By the time I got to Congress in 2001, the process had become corrupt. I mean, horribly corrupt. A couple of my colleagues actually went to jail for trading earmarks for money under the table. And then trading earmarks for campaign contributions was more legal. And that went on with abandon. But I think for those who believe that this will somehow grease the skids and we'll, all work together, I would point to 2005, which was really the nadir of earmarking, where there were nearly 20,000 earmarks spread across all the appropriation bills. That year, we passed a total of 2 appropriation bills before the end of the fiscal year. So this notion that that's what you need to grease the skids to actually do the work of Congress, it's not borne out by history. And what I fear will do is it'll lead to more corruption. Now they'll put some guardrails and maybe you won't see the extent. But here is the bigger problem with earmarking, in my view. We're talking about when all earmarks, even in the NADAR earmarking in 2005, it was only about 2 or 3% of the federal budget. But what happens is when you bring earmarking back and you try to do it in a way that everybody has some skin in the game or has a few earmarks, the Appropriations Committee, which has the role of oversight on a lot of our appropriations, will end up spending, if history is any guide, will end up spending 90% of their time or more just doling out earmarks and making sure that they're done in a way that people won't complain and whatever else, instead of exercising oversight on the other 93% of the budget. And that, so it's a misallocation of resources, and it really turns the Congress into more of a favor factory, as opposed to the body that has the authority to appropriate and then exercise oversight on those appropriations. So I'm not a big fan of it, and this notion that somehow it will engender enough bipartisanship. I'm not too fond of the kind of bipartisanship that we saw, in 2004, 5, 6. That's just not good.
Thank you. Another question, kind of turning to the impeachment trial of former President Bush. We know that there were only 10 Republicans, right, that joined all the Democrats voting for impeachment. One in particular, Jamie Herrera Butler, she's from Washington State. She gave a speech, and she said that she's choosing truth, not fear. And I think that echoes a lot in your book when you're talking about objectivity and truth and kind of reeling things back in, making sure that traditional conservatives do embrace truth, right? And that's something that you have to kind of have the courage to stand for. As we know, of course, in the Senate, things did not materialize, did not get a conviction in the Senate. Were you surprised by that? Or as soon as the impeachment talks were up again, were you like, okay, this is not going to happen? He's, former president's never going to get convicted. Or what were your thoughts there?
Yeah, I thought it was going to be a difficult sell when the president was already out of office to have a trial. That the main, remedy that impeachment brings is removal. And when he was already removed, that was just an easy excuse for Republicans to say, hey, we shouldn't do it. Now, had I been in the Senate, I would have voted to impeach or to convict. And had I been in the House, I would have voted to impeach. If it's not an impeachable offense to encourage a mob to storm the Capitol to overturn an election that you lost, I mean, I think that justifies impeachment. I did express concern that if you had a president impeached again a second time and not removed, it might say more about what a president can get away with than what he can't. And that turned out to be the case. And I don't like that message has been sent. But if you're in the Senate, I like what Mitt Romney said during the first impeachment. You can talk about whether or not impeachment charges should have been brought, or the president should have been impeached. That's really kind of a political decision made by the House. But once you're a senator and you're presented with the evidence, you have to, be a jurist, and you have to follow the evidence. And I think those that voted to convict did follow the evidence.
Thank you for that. More on that issue, we had a question that was submitted that is asking about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And Section 3, states that any person who has taken an oath to protect the Constitution can be barred from holding office if they participated in an insurrection against the United States or helped enemies thereof. So even though it was intended for ex-Confederate soldiers, really, do you think that this section can be applied in the 21st century? Do you think it would be litigated to prevent? You don't think he's going to run again, but if he did, do you think this is an avenue where he might be stopped?
Well, this would, it was thought, and it was pushed by serious senators like Tim Kaine of Virginia, a Democrat, saying, we don't have to get a 2/3. This is just a majority vote. So that may be more attractive. But if that something like that were to come up, if the president were to indicate he was going to run again, that if that failed, that would simply, I think, make more of a martyr out of the president. And so I don't think it's going to come to anything. But I do think there were serious legal scholars that I respect who thought that might have been maybe a preferable remedy, given the timing that this last impeachment and trial happened. So, but I can't see that being employed with a fear that the president will run again. I just don't think that he's going to be there, but he will dangle it out for a long time simply to be more relevant. I do think that on that subject, I think the president former President Trump is losing influence daily. It's just very difficult, no matter who you are, to maintain influence. Once you lose the trappings of office and the levers of power, and then in today's world, when you lose your Twitter platform, which is about all he had, you're going to lose influence. And Trumpism, isn't so much a philosophy as it is an attitude. As we're tough, we're owning the libs, we're fighting, and it relies on winning. And that's why former President Trump has been so reluctant to admit that he lost, because you lose that swagger that's necessary to keep Trumpism going. So I do think he has tremendous influence over the party now, but that will wane more quickly than he wants it to, simply because you just, and there's got to be something there. And the president just, he's not a philosopher. He's not interested in policy, really. So there's not enough to really maintain that, nor has he surrounded himself with people who could keep a movement going like that. So I think he will lose influence faster than he wants to.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll take some kind of current questions that we have in the chat here, and I'll ask them. This is again with the Republican Party. Stephen asks, Senator Mitch McConnell has been the Republican leader since 2007. Is he up to the task of defining the party image and holding or expanding the number of Republican seats in 2022? What should Senate Republicans be doing during the 117th Congress?
That's a great question. Mitch McConnell is a tactician. He's maybe one of the most consequential conservatives over the past couple of decades, if for no other reason, the way he was able to engineer the nomination and ultimate appointment of a lot of federal judges, which will conservative federal judges, which will affect politics for a long time. I'm having a hard time seeing where, and I know that I've talked to some of my former colleagues, and there's some concern that there hasn't been enough direction from Mitch McConnell or attempts to unify the party around themes that will not just, energize the so-called base, but actually can win seats in states like Arizona or Pennsylvania or some of the North Carolina, where it's going to be more difficult. So I do think that, for example, with this this big relief package that passed, there is a real chance that this could be inflationary, and that standing up and just talking about the level, as Republicans used to do, And here you have even some Democrats or some liberals, if you will, Larry Summers and others who are still. Larry Summers was on television yesterday, still saying this was a bad deal. This is too much, and it'll come back to bite Democrats because it will affect the economy. It's always easier politically to vote no on something like this because you don't know what will happen 2 years down the road. And if it's like what happened in 2009, and then there's some very real differences between this and the big stimulus package passed then, but that very much turned to Republicans' favor. But it was because Republicans really focused on that and weren't chasing conspiracy theories that we really won the last election or trying to make it more difficult for people to vote and win elections that way. They actually said, we believe that the country is center right. We believe that the country as a whole believe that these policies that the Democrats are pursuing are too liberal. They spend too much money. Deficits are too high. It'll lead to inflation. And then the entire economy will be off. That's more of a message that I would hope that Republicans would push rather than going down this rabbit hole about the last election or trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. That's just another anti-democratic move.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That's definitely happening in state legislatures all over the country, trying to curtail and suppress, people's right to vote. And I have a question here about HR 1 from the Democrats. Derek says HR 1 is an ambitious attempt to restore legitimacy and trust in U.S. elections through federal legislation. He said, but there doesn't appear to be a Republican counterpart to HR 1. Can you think of, first of all, what do you think about HR 1? And do you think that there should be a moderate, principled, conservative legislative solution that's not HR 1, but that's something that conservatives or the Republican Party should put forward?
Well, there are some elements of HR 1 that are good and needed, given what some states are trying to do, state legislatures out there. I mean, what's happening in Georgia in particular is just an affront to democracy and a blatant attempt to suppress a vote that you don't like. But much of HR 1 is federalizing elections where they shouldn't be federalized and going, talking about public funding of elections, and it's just far too much of a big grab bag of progressive ideas on elections. And so I think it would be much better if it were, if they want to get it through, and they won't be able to get it through the Senate unless they were to nix the filibuster or something, and they won't be able to, gratefully. But yeah, I wish that Republicans would support some of this, but Republicans are going the other way in state legislatures, and there's really nobody on the national scene among elected office holders who are standing up forcefully enough and saying, hey, let's win elections using ideas and trying to move people and persuade people to come on our side of the aisle rather than try to suppress the vote on the other side. I do think that that's a mistake politically. Obviously, it's a mistake policy-wise, but it's a mistake politically as well. Because when we focus, I mean, if you look at Arizona's Republican Party, where they'll say that most of the base of the party, is saying that election integrity is the most important thing. Obviously, election integrity is important, but there is no evidence that the last election was missing election integrity. And if Republicans really want to win going ahead, we've got to come forward with some ideas that are better than the other side has. And people, in the areas that Republicans really need to pick up on, among, like I said, millennials, and suburbanites, people with college degrees, we've got to get off this kick of just trying to suppress votes and actually persuade people to come to our side of the argument.
There was a, thank you for that. There was a question that somebody asked, because you had mentioned the local Republican Party here in Arizona. And they asked, I don't know if you're gonna be able to answer this, but, is Kelly Ward, do you think she's gonna kind of, be quiet moving forward? Or do you think she'll kind of continue to double down on, leading the party adrift, if you will, based on everything we've talked about?
Well, that's a great question. State parties, Arizona is more emblematic maybe than some, but a lot of these state parties are having the same problem as these parties have moved toward trafficking and conspiracy theories, and in Arizona's case, anti-immigration thing. The business community and other natural allies and traditional allies of the Republican Party have quit contributing or funding or being involved. And to try to get your neighbor, a Republican, to go and sit through a district meeting every month and be a precinct committeeman, when all they're doing is talking about how we lost the last election was rigged, or Barack Obama was never a citizen, or whatever. You just can't do it. And so what happens is, for lack of local support, the party has to turn to the national party, in this case, the RNC under President Trump, and then becomes more dependent for funding for get out the vote efforts and everything else. And it's just a cycle that keeps the party on the fringe. And that works well to win primaries for extreme candidates, but it doesn't do you very well if you're trying to win statewide. What I hope happens, and I didn't think I'd be here, but I think we need desperately electoral reform in the mold of what perhaps they did in Alaska, where they have a top 4 system and then ranked choice voting. I'm a huge fan of ranked choice voting. That tends to push away the extremes. But if we ended up in Arizona with something just like top 2, where the top 2 candidates, regardless of party, make it to the general election, that would be a plus. And I'm very much in favor of that, because I think it's going to be a long, long time, if ever, that we get the Republican Party back to being a responsible, sane party, unless we have reforms like this. Because it tends to, like I said, it kind of feeds on itself. The more extreme you get, the more you have to rely on people who are even more extreme. And that's enough to win primaries, but not statewide elections.
My students are huge fans of the ranked choice voting. We had a discussion about it, and they were saying exactly that. Why don't we have this? That's something that I really think that generation is going to try and move forward for sure.
Well, I do think you will have efforts that wouldn't affect things in 2022. That's likely when it would be put on the ballot, but it would starting in 2024. And I think that if anything is going to save the Republican Party, it's reforms like that. But it will be very much opposed by party officials and those on the extreme, the base, that subset of a subset of a subset that controls Republican primaries. And on the Democratic side, the more progressive or liberal side of the Democrats won't favor it either. But I think, frankly, there may be enough in the middle where we could get it passed. And as people like Bob Robb, who's a really astute observer and pundit and writer, has observed, I mean, when you have now a third of the state registered as independents or party not designated, and having difficulty actually participating in party primaries, it becomes an equity thing too. Why are taxpayers funding these party primaries that they really can't participate or have a difficult time participating in? So I think a top 2 kind of reform has probably the most appeal because it's simple, and it would lead to, I think, more centrist candidates and more responsible campaigning.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely agree there. Okay, a couple more questions. There's so many. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but I think this is a good one. What policy mistakes do you see Senators Kelly and Sinema making that could give Republicans opportunities to maybe take a Senate seat or both back?
Well, I think that Arizona is still a center-right state. Republicans still enjoy a voter registration advantage of, I think, about 200,000, and independents tend to favor the Republican Party. So Kyrsten Sinema has been very much the moderate that she said she was going to be when she went to the Senate, and her stance on the filibuster and on minimum wage or whatnot, I think speaks to more. She's getting a lot of heat from progressive wing of her party, but it's in my view is the right policy and is certainly the right politics. I think the danger for her and Mark Kelly is to if you're identified too much with just basically rubber stamping whatever Chuck Schumer wants, you're going to have trouble. Mark Kelly is up in 2022, Kyrsten Sinema in 2024. She has more time, but he's really going to have the spotlight on him, and he I think it would be a mistake to get far out front on some of the progressive ideas, whether it's spending. You might see it on infrastructure or other spending bills coming up. If you're identified too much with just whatever the Democratic Party wants, then if Republicans were to put up a candidate who actually was more that wasn't trafficking in conspiracy theories and wasn't a Trump acolyte, then Democrats would have trouble. So yeah, and this is my probably conservative bias, but I think that both of our Democratic senators, if they will be deliberate and more moderate, then they stand a good shot of re-election. If they don't, then if there is a more moderate Republican, that Republican would have a good chance.
Yeah, definitely a tough, complex spot to be in.
I can tell you what Mark Kelly is I'm sure if I were him, I would want Kelly Ward running as a Republican, or somebody that she campaigns with and mightily for, and that would allow Mark Kelly or Kyrsten Sinema to be much more progressive, I think, than they are. Just because Republicans will be, I mean, we've tried this twice now in the last couple of years, having somebody run who stands on a campaign stage with Donald Trump, and he'll likely come to Arizona and campaign with a Republican that he likes. If I were a Republican running for the Senate in Arizona, I would say, please, Donald Trump, stay where you are. I don't want your support. Right. And then you have a much better shot at winning.
Thank you. Yeah, very smart. Switching gears a little bit, this is a great question. Chris says, I followed your policy positions and experience with Cuba. How do you see the progression of relations with Cuba in the coming years under the Biden administration?
Great question. I hope that the Biden administration would follow more of what the Obama administration did in terms of opening and establishing diplomatic relations. My goal is to have all Cubans, able to exercise freedom and to have real elections. But we've had policies over the last 60 years that really have, I think, aided the Castro government in keeping hold of the system there. So I don't think our policies have really had the intended effect, and we need to change it. And that would be, I think, for Joe Biden, to take measures that will aid the private sector in Cuba. And there is a private sector, largely thanks to what Barack Obama did in allowing unlimited remittances, for example, allowing unlimited Cuban American travel to the island, encouraging others to go and help and invest in the private sector. So you have a far more vibrant private sector, and I think there's an opportunity to expand that. President Trump gave a parting gift that was not a kind one in redesignating Cuba as a terrorist nation. That I didn't see, and nobody has really seen the evidence for that, but it does make it more difficult for Joe Biden to move ahead with the kind of reforms that I think he would like to do. And he just doesn't seem to be as interested as Barack Obama was in transforming or changing our policy there. I think he'll be more reticent, particularly after what happened in Florida, where the Cuban American vote very much went for Republicans. They wanted somebody who was tougher, if you will, on the Castro government. Now, I have a different view of what tough is with the Castro government. I think it would be tough on the Castro government if we actually just allowed every American to travel and to trade. And, as I've said before, if you want to get rid of the Castros, make them deal with spring break once or twice. That's the best thing that could happen. But I'd like to see more changes that are going to happen, but there will be some loosening of some of the Trump era restrictions. And that's a good thing for freedom lovers in Cuba, in my view.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And I think we have to ask it. I think you already answered it a little bit, but maybe you could expand. The filibuster. So one member says, I was a supporter of the filibuster, but I've changed my mind. He said it just allows senators to kind of avoid tough votes. Why are we still preserving this relic of the past? Why preserve it in the Senate? Why make the argument for why we should keep the filibuster?
We should keep the filibuster because it's one of the last remaining mechanisms we have that drives the parties together to actually cooperate. And if we make the Senate a majoritarian institution just like the House, then we'll see more legislation like we've seen over the past few years, that the party will pass something with a bare majority, whether you use rules of reconciliation or other ways to get around the filibuster, that it's a policy that doesn't last, that doesn't endure, that as soon as the pendulum swings, and it will swing more wildly if you do get rid of the filibuster, then the next party that controls simply tries to undo what the last party that had a bare majority tried to do, rather than trying to reform policy that may need some reform, and try to just end it. And you have more wild swings. So I'm not a fan of getting rid of the filibuster. It's popular in the House of Representatives. Obviously, in the House, you always refer to the Senate as where all good bills go to die, and sometimes that is the case. But in my defense, I have to say, never at any time when I was in the House for 12 years, being frustrated with a lot of legislation that I sponsored or supported dying in the Senate, I never wanted to get rid of the Senate filibuster because it brings the parties together and it moderates policy, and that's a good thing. Now, you've got to be careful what you wish for. Right now, Democrats could say, all right, let's get rid of the filibuster. One, that doesn't mean you're going to have the votes for some of these measures like HR 1 or an infrastructure package or something like that. But if you get rid of it, it's more likely in that case that because getting rid of the filibuster would allow you to push legislation through that should have more consensus. It will mean that Republicans will have an easier time taking control of the Senate in just 2 years. And guess what? That filibuster will be gone. So on the Republican side, you always are concerned, about things like minimum wage or whatever else, which could wildly swing if you don't have a filibuster. On the Democratic side, you ought to be worried about, right to work legislation and labor protections and whatnot that Republicans, each party that's in the minority wants to protect certain priorities, so Republicans and Democrats. And sometimes it's a bad thing. And many times there are good things that are protected by requiring a supermajority. So I'm a big fan of the filibuster. I do think there are reforms to it that could happen. I participated in a lot of discussions and studies and meetings during my time that would have reformed it and made it more difficult. For example, that would be proper. But to get rid of it, I wouldn't go there.
Well, I am afraid that we're out of time and we're going to have to end this terrific conversation. I just want to thank Senator Flake so much for being with us here today and for all of his thoughtful comments. And I also want to thank Dr. Woodall for a terrific job guiding this conversation. Thank you all so much, and thank you everybody for being here today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Gina.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Bye.